The evening was quiet, a soft stillness hanging in the air like the weight of a forgotten memory. In Sparta, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the last remnants of twilight clung to the sky as if reluctant to surrender to the dark. The streets of the city were empty, their usual bustle silenced by the slow march of time. The only sounds in Alecta's small, stone-walled home were the gentle whispers of the wind outside and the steady hum of the loom in the corner of the room. A faint scent of lavender and the earthy aroma of stone filled the air, as though the very walls of the house held on to the past. Alecta sat by the loom, her hands moving with the rhythm of a dance she had known for years. Each thread she pulled was deliberate, measured, her fingers were steady, precise, as though every movement held a deeper purpose. The shuttle passed through the threads, creating patterns weaving fabric from the past and the present alike. The sounds of the room, quiet and constant, wrapped around her like an old, familiar song. The soft rustle of the cloth as it shifted on the loom was the only sound that broke the silence, but even that was soothing, a kind of quiet reassurance. She was alone, but the silence was not empty. There was something intimate about it. It was a silence that spoke to her soul, one that carried memories, whispers of a time when the world outside had been different. She thought of her husband Demetrius, who had left years ago to fight on the front lines of the war. How long has it been now? 3 years, 4? It hardly mattered anymore. Time in the absence of his presence had become a blur. She thought of her son Leandros, who had been just a boy when Demetrius left. Now he was nearly of age, strong, and growing soon he would be expected to join the ranks of the warriors just as his father had. Alecta's fingers hesitated for a brief moment as she recalled her husband's last words before he left. The way his eyes had softened when he held her close, as if trying to tell her everything that words could not. "I'll return," he had promised, but there was something in the way he said it, an uncertainty perhaps, or a silent understanding that neither of them dared acknowledge. The shuttle glided smoothly through the threads again, and Alecta's thoughts returned to her work. Her mind wandered back to the past, to days before war had consumed the lives of so many, to a time when her family sat together in the evenings when Demetrius would recount tales of distant lands, of battles fought in the name of Sparta. She had always listened with fascination, marveling at the stories of far-off places and brave warriors. Yet there was always peace in her heart, a belief that her life would be different. And then there was Leandros, her son, who had once played at her feet as Demetrius spoke. She could still hear his laughter, the sound of his small hands clapping in delight, the innocence in his eyes as he listened to his father's stories of glory and triumph. He had dreamt of adventure even then, long before he understood what it truly meant to fight. Alecta had always hoped that those dreams would stay with him, that he would grow up to find something other than war to shape his future. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. Alecta pulled the threads tighter, the fabric growing thicker under her hands. Her eyes drifted toward the window, though she knew there was little to see in the growing darkness. She wondered if her husband still remembered the sound of her voice, the feel of her touch. Did he still think of her when he faced the endless battles? Did he long for the quiet evenings they once shared? Or had he become as hardened as the soldiers he fought beside history remembers their battles? Alecta thought to herself, her fingers working faster now, as if trying to outrun the thoughts that were chasing her. But I remember the silence between them. The silence before the clang of swords, the silence before the cries of war. It was in that silence that Alecta had once found peace. She remembered the quiet moments they had shared, just the three of them. The way Demetrius would sit beside her at the hearth, telling stories that were half imagined, half true, his voice rich with warmth. She remembered the soft glow of the fire, the flickering light dancing across the walls, and the way her son's eyes had shone with curiosity and wonder. But that silence, that peace had slipped away. War had come, and with it the sound of marching feet, the clash of metal, the screams of soldiers. Demetrius had left, and the world had shifted. Now there was only the constant hum of the loom, the steady rhythm of the shuttle passing through the fabric, and the heavy silence that filled her heart. Alecta's mind wandered again, but this time it was not to the past. Her thoughts turned to Leandros and the growing realization that soon he too would be swept up in the tide of war. He was already tall, strong. His muscles were beginning to define themselves as he trained with the other young men of Sparta. She had seen the change in him, the fire in his eyes when he spoke of battle. She had tried to protect him, to shield him from the world of warriors that surrounded them, but there was no escaping it. Sparta was a land built on war, and every man, every boy, was expected to take up arms when the time came. Leandros was becoming a man, and Alecta could no longer deny the inevitable. She had seen the way he looked at the soldiers marching through the city, the way his gaze lingered on the warriors preparing for battle. She could see the longing in his eyes, the same longing that had once been in Demetrius's eyes before he had left her. She wanted to cry out to beg him to stay, to turn away from the path that seemed to await him. But she knew it was futile. She knew that there was no fighting the call of duty. Her son, like every other Spartan before him, would answer that call whether she wanted him to or not. Alecta sighed softly, the sound barely audible over the soft rustle of the fabric she was weaving. She had spent so many years trying to hold on to something, some fragment of the life she had once known, but the threads were slipping through her fingers. Demetrius was gone. Leandros was growing up, and the world around her was changing in ways she could not control. The loom, though, remained. It was her constant, her anchor in the storm. She wove each thread a memory, each pass of the shuttle a prayer. She wove for the past, for the present, and for the future. The fabric in front of her grew thicker, richer with each passing moment. It was a tapestry of loss and hope, of love and duty, of peace and war. And as she worked, Alecta could not help but wonder, would history remember her family? Would they remember the silence between the battles, the quiet moments that had once defined them? Or would they only remember the bloodshed, the victories, the warriors who had fought for Sparta's glory? For now she could only remember the silence, and that was enough. The loom creaked as Alecta's hands moved with practiced grace, guiding the shuttle through the strands of thread. The rhythmic hum of the loom filled the silence of the room, a constant companion in the long, lonely hours that stretched endlessly before her. As the threads intertwined, her thoughts wandered back to a time when this silence had been different, more comforting, when it had been filled with the warmth of a family, the laughter of her husband Demetrius, and the eager, youthful chatter of her son Leandros. She remembered it as if it were yesterday, the first time Demetrius had left for war. The sun had been high in the sky, casting a golden light over the land as she watched him stride away from their home. His armor gleamed with the promise of battle, his sword at his side a symbol of his duty. He had turned toward her once, his face set in the determination of a warrior who had seen too many campaigns. His eyes, once soft with love for her, were now cold with resolve. Alecta had stood in the doorway, her heart pounding, her breath catching in her throat. She had tried to smile, to mask the fear that clawed at her insides, but it had been a smile filled with a quiet terror. She had whispered the words she had wanted to say aloud, but they had been lost in the wind. "Come back to me." But he had not heard her. He had not looked back. And with that he had disappeared into the world of battle, leaving her alone in their home. The echo of his footsteps fading as the door closed behind him. The silence that followed had felt suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. She had tried to fill the void with mundane tasks, with the comforting rhythm of the loom, but it never quite worked. There had been a constant ache, an emptiness that no amount of weaving could fix. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Alecta had learned to live with the waiting for news, for letters, for a sign that Demetrius was still alive. It had become a part of her life, an unspoken routine. She had learned to endure it, though it had worn her down thread by thread like the fabric she wove. The loom before her was a reminder of that long, unrelenting wait. Her fingers moved through the threads just as they had when Demetrius first left, but now they moved with the weight of the years that had passed since then. Her mind was a battlefield of its own, filled with memories of the past, and the fear of what the future might hold. She thought of Demetrius, what he had endured in the years since he had left. Had he grown weary of the endless campaigns of the constant bloodshed? Had he changed, become a man she no longer recognized? And what of Leandros? The boy she had once held in her arms was now a young man, tall and strong, with the same fire burning in his eyes that had once burned in his father's. She had tried to hold on to him, to protect him from the life she feared, but she could see the restlessness in him. It was there beneath the surface, just waiting to burst forth. Leandros had always been a curious child, full of questions about the world, about the warriors who walked through the streets of Sparta, their heads held high, their eyes filled with pride and purpose. He had watched them with wide eyes, yearning for the adventure and glory they seemed to promise. Alecta had tried to shield him from that world, tried to convince him that there was more to life than the sword and shield. She had dreamed of a different future for him, a life filled with peace, with laughter, with moments of quiet that she had so longed for. But as he had grown, the fire in his eyes had only intensified. She could see it in the way he moved, the way he carried himself with a quiet confidence that mirrored Demetrius's. It was a look that spoke of ambition, of a desire to prove himself, to make his mark on the world. She had tried to talk to him about it, to share her concerns, but he had listened with the same indifference that Demetrius had shown when she had begged him not to go to war. It was the same restlessness, the same drive that ran through the blood of every Spartan warrior. Alecta closed her eyes, her heart heavy with the weight of it all. She had always known deep down that this day would come, that Leandros would one day feel the call of war, just as his father had before him. But she had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that he might choose a different path, that he might see the value of a life that wasn't defined by battle and conquest. Yet as she looked at him now, standing before her, the same fire burning in his gaze, she knew there was no escaping it. Sparta was a land that bred warriors, and every man, every boy, was born with the weight of that legacy on his shoulders. She had tried to protect him, to shelter him from the brutality of it all, but it was no use. The call to arms was too strong, too ingrained in the very fabric of their society, and so the day would come when he too would walk away from her just as Demetrius had. He would leave for the front lines, and she would be left alone once again, with only the loom to keep her company. But she could not stop him. She could not change the course of his destiny. Alecta knew that the path he was destined to walk was one that was forged long before his birth, long before she had ever known the man who would become his father. It was a path that had been set by the gods, by the very nature of Sparta itself. The warriors who fought for their city, for their people, were not just soldiers. They were part of something greater, something that could not be undone. Alecta's fingers moved mechanically now, each motion of the loom pulling the threads of her thoughts together as if trying to weave them into something whole. The sound of the shuttle passing through the threads was a comforting rhythm, but it did little to ease the ache in her chest. She had spent so many years, waiting so many years, clinging to the hope that Demetrius would return, that Leandros might find another way, but now she could no longer deny the truth. They were both part of a world that would never allow them to live in peace. The loom seemed to mock her as she worked. The threads crossed and interwove, just as her hopes and fears had done over the years. Each pass of the shuttle was another moment slipping away from her, another step closer to a future she could not control. As she continued to weave, Alecta's thoughts drifted back to the day Demetrius had left. She had watched him walk away, his armor gleaming in the sunlight, his face set with a determination she had never fully understood. She had whispered to him, hoping he might hear her, hoping he might feel the weight of her love and fear. But he had not heard her. he had walked away, leaving her with nothing but the silence. And now, as she sat at the loom, she realized that the silence was not the absence of sound. It was the absence of choice. It was the recognition that in the end, they were all bound by the same fate, one that they could not escape no matter how hard they tried. Leandros would go to war. Demetrius had already fought his battles, and she, Alecta, would remain here in the quiet of their home, weaving the threads of memory into the fabric of her life. The weight of memory was heavy. It was something that could not be undone, something that lingered long after the battles had ended, long after the warriors had returned or failed to return. And as Alecta wove, her fingers moved not just to create fabric, but to preserve the past, to hold on to the fleeting moments of peace, even as the future pulled her family further into the chaos of war. Alecta sat in the dimly lit room, the loom in front of her still and silent. The house, once filled with the lively hum of daily life, had grown quieter over the years. Her hands moved methodically, but her thoughts were far away. They always were. The threads she wove seemed to weave a tapestry of memories, memories of days when Demetrius had been by her side, when the world had felt more whole. But those days were fading, like the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight. The war had taken him, and with it the warmth that once filled their home. A year had passed since Alecta had received the last letter from Demetrius. It had been brief, a few lines scrawled hastily across the page, but enough to bring her some comfort. "I am alive. I will return when the fighting is over." Those words, simple and sparse, had been a balm to her fears. But as the months dragged on and the days bled into one another, that letter had become little more than a distant memory. The silence between them had only grown. It was a silence that gnawed at her, a suffocating weight that pressed down on her chest with every passing day. The letters stopped coming. The messages ceased. It felt as if Demetrius had been swallowed by the war, lost to a world of blood and steel, where the sound of a man's voice was drowned out by the clash of swords and the cries of dying men. The thought of it consumed Alecta, filling her with dread that she might never hear from him again, never feel his arms around her, never hear his soothing voice. But as the weeks turned into months, she had learned to survive in the absence of news. It became easier, almost mechanical. She would wake each morning, drink her tea, and sit by the loom. She would weave the rhythmic motions, calming her nerves, though the silence never quite left her. She had learned to live in it, but it had hollowed her out. It was as if with every thread she wove, she was trying to stitch together a piece of herself that had been lost. Then one evening, everything changed. It was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones, making the fire in the hearth seem almost futile. Alecta had just finished a long day of weaving, and the room was quiet save for the crackle of the flames. She had been lost in her thoughts again, her mind wandering to places she could not follow, when she heard it, a sound she had not expected to hear in so long. The door creaked open. At first, Alecta thought it was the wind. The house was old. The door creaked and groaned in the changing weather. But then she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking toward her. Her heart leaped in her chest, and she froze the shuttle in her hands, faltering for just a moment. Could it be? She turned, her breath catching in her throat, and there, standing in the doorway, was Demetrius. He looked different. His once proud armor was battered, dented from years of battle. His face, which had always been strong, was now weathered, drawn with exhaustion. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and his once lustrous hair was now streaked with gray, tangled and matted from the hardships of war. But it was him, Demetrius, the man she had loved, the man she had sent off to fight the man who had promised to return to her. Alecta's heart skipped a beat. She stood there for a moment, staring at him, unable to move, unable to speak. Her breath came in shallow gasps, as if her body couldn't quite believe what her eyes were seeing. Was this a dream? Had she imagined it all? But no, he was real. He was standing there alive. He was home. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Alecta's eyes scanned his face, searching for the man she had known. The man who had once whispered dreams of peace in her ear as they lay together in the quiet of the night. That man seemed so far away now, hidden behind the armor of a soldier, the scars of battle etched deep in his skin. His eyes, though they were still the same, a deep burning brown, though shadowed now with something Alecta couldn't quite name. Her hands trembled, the loom forgotten beside her. She wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around him, but she hesitated. The distance between them had grown too vast in the years that had passed. There were no words to bridge the gap. She could feel the weight of the years between them, the silence that had stretched too long, the pain of separation that had worn them both thin. Finally, it was Demetrius who spoke. His voice was low and rough, as if it hadn't been used in a long while. The words came out thick, almost like a whisper, but they hit her like a shock to the chest. "I'm home," he said. The sound of his voice, the voice she had longed to hear, the voice that had comforted her through countless sleepless nights, brought a wave of emotion she hadn't prepared for. Alecta felt tears spring to her eyes, but she held them back, not wanting to show him the depth of her feelings.
She couldn't, not yet. There was too much she didn't understand. Too much that had changed. But in that moment, everything seemed to fall away. For a fleeting instant, the years of waiting, the silence, the longing, everything disappeared. It was just the two of them standing there in the flickering candlelight, breathing the same air, their hearts beating in sync. The silence between them was still there, but now it was different. It wasn't suffocating anymore.
It was the kind of silence that filled the room with everything that had been unsaid, the years of separation, the hurt, the longing, but also the deep unspoken understanding that they were together again. For better or worse, they were standing on the same ground, facing each other once more. Alecta finally took a step forward, her legs weak beneath her. She reached out a trembling hand, almost afraid to touch him, as if the contact might shatter the fragile moment they had just shared. Demetrius didn't move at first, as though he too was unsure how to bridge the space between them. Then slowly he closed the distance, pulling her into his arms. It wasn't the embrace of a man returning home from battle. There was no joy, no relief in it. Instead, it was the embrace of two people who had been torn apart by time, by distance, by war. It was tentative, uncertain, as if they were both afraid that the other might slip away. But for a moment, Alecta let herself feel it, the warmth of his body against hers. The familiar scent of him. The strong arms that had once held her so tightly. It was like stepping into the past, but even as she clung to him, she knew that the man in her arms was not the same man who had left. He had been changed by the war, just as she had been changed by the years of waiting. They were both different now, and nothing could undo the distance that had grown between them. But for a brief moment, she didn't care. For a brief moment they were together again, and that was enough. The world outside could wait. There was only the two of them standing in the quiet, breathing in the shared silence. The moment passed, as all moments do. Demetrius pulled back slightly, his hands lingering on her shoulders, his eyes searching her face as if trying to read her, to understand the depth of the time they had lost. "How long has it been?" he asked quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Alecta swallowed hard, trying to find the words. "Too long," she finally whispered. "Too long indeed." The silence between them had stretched far beyond what either of them could have ever imagined. But now, in the glow of the firelight, in the warmth of their reunion, it seemed possible just for a moment to pretend that everything was as it once had been. But they both knew that the war had left its mark on them, on their lives, and on their love. And though they were together again, the journey ahead would not be so simple. It would take more than just words, more than just time to rebuild what had been lost. But for now they had this moment, and that was enough. The days that followed Demetrius's return were not the reunion Alecta had imagined. The warmth of their embrace, the fleeting moment of connection, quickly faded into the cold reality of the man who had come back to her. She had waited for years, clung to the hope that the love they had shared would endure, but something had changed. The man who walked beside her now was not the same. The years of war had altered him in ways that Alecta could not fully understand, nor could she stop. The weight of it all, of battles fought, of lives lost, of decisions made in the heat of conflict, had left its mark. It was subtle at first, just a shift in his demeanor, a quiet tension that lingered in the air whenever they were in the same room. Demetrius spoke little at first, and when he did, it was not of her, or of their past, or of the family they had once dreamed of. Instead, his words were filled with strategy, with plans for the next campaign, with brief mentions of the enemy of fortifications and supplies. Conversations that once had been filled with laughter and tender moments were now consumed by the war he had fought for so long. Sparta cannot afford to delay, he would say, his voice heavy with the urgency of his thoughts. We need more men, more weapons. The next attack is imminent. Alecta listened, but the words seemed foreign to her now. She could see the difference in him, how the man who had once dreamed of peace, who had spoken of a life beyond war, had been replaced by a soldier whose thoughts were entirely consumed by the conflict. There was no more talk of a future together, of days filled with peace. It was all about survival, about what came next. The man she had once known had vanished, replaced by someone colder, someone distant. And Alecta in her heart knew that the war had not only taken Demetrius away for those years, it had taken something more. It had taken the light from his eyes, the softness in his voice, the warmth in his touch. Each day Alecta watched him, and each day she felt him slip further away. He had grown leaner, harder. His once youthful face was now lined with fatigue, the shadow of too many battles reflected in his eyes. His hands, once gentle, now moved with mechanical precision. Every word he spoke, every action he took, seemed driven by the soldier he had become, not the man who had promised her a future. She longed to reach him, to pull him back to her, but there was a wall now. Alecta had never felt the distance between them so acutely before. There was no more tenderness in his gaze, no more tenderness in his touch. When he kissed her, it was not the same as before. It was rushed as if the act was something he had to do, not something he longed to do. The connection they had shared, the passion that had once burned between them, had been dulled, like a blade that had lost its edge. Every night, when the house was silent, except for the occasional crackle of the fire, Alecta would lie awake beside him, wondering if the man she had loved was still inside the shell that lay next to her. She would hear his shallow breathing, feel the slight tremor in his body, and wonder if the war had taken even more from him than she had realized. What had it done to him truly? What had he seen that had left him so cold, so distant? And then there were the nights when he would wake abruptly, his body tense, his eyes wide with some unseen terror. Alecta would sit up, her heart racing, as he muttered under his breath, his hands shaking. He would not speak to her then, would not allow her to comfort him. His gaze would become wild, as if he were lost in some faraway place, fighting battles that no one else could see. She wanted to reach out to hold him, to bring him back from wherever he had gone, but he always pulled away, his eyes dark with a mix of shame and confusion. One night she tried to speak to him about it. He had woken in the middle of the night, again sweating, his body rigid. Alecta had gently placed her hand on his arm, her voice soft. "Demetrius, talk to me. What happened? Tell me what's going on in your mind." He had turned to her, then his face twisted in a way that frightened her. "I don't want to remember," he had snapped. "I can't. Don't make me." The words had hurt her, cut deeper than anything else he had said, because she knew. She knew that the war had changed him, had taken something from him that could never be returned. The dreams of peace, of returning to the life they once had, were gone now, buried beneath the weight of the things he had done, the things he had seen. He had seen death, destruction, pain. He had been forced to kill, to watch men fall around him, and in the process something inside him had withered. The man who had left her so many years ago with promises of return was no more. The man who stood before her now was a shadow, a shell of the man she had married, the man who had once whispered of a future where their son would grow up in peace. Alecta tried to understand. She truly did. She tried to comprehend the cost of the war, the toll it had taken on him. But every day the distance between them grew. It was as if there were an invisible barrier she could not break through, no matter how much she longed to. Demetrius had become a man shaped by the war, a man who could no longer see past the next battle, past the next conquest. He had become a soldier through, and the man she had once loved was slipping further and further away. And it wasn't just Demetrius that was changing. Alecta felt it too. She felt herself becoming someone she barely recognized, someone who was constantly waiting, constantly hoping for a glimpse of the man he used to be, but never truly finding him. It was as if she were living with a stranger, someone who wore her husband's face but had none of his heart, and it was breaking her. Slowly, bit by bit, she was being undone by the war, just as Demetrius was. She found herself questioning everything. Was this the price of war? The price of peace? Had Demetrius been irrevocably changed by the blood he had spilled, by the men he had killed, by the horrors he had witnessed? Was there a part of him left that could return to the life they had once dreamed of, or had it been destroyed forever in the fires of war? And what about Leandros? What about their son? He had grown up hearing the stories of his father, of the man who had once dreamed of a future beyond battle, beyond the harshness of war. But now Alecta feared that even Leandros could see the changes in his father. The restlessness that had once burned in Demetrius's heart had passed to their son, and Alecta wondered in the quietest moments of her thoughts if Leandros too would be consumed by the same fire. Would he become like Demetrius, like the man she barely recognized now, or would he find a way to carve out a life for himself that wasn't defined by the weight of war? She feared that the war had already claimed Leandros in ways she couldn't yet understand. She feared that one day he would leave as Demetrius had, and that the cycle would repeat itself generation after generation, each one falling prey to the same fate. Alecta knew that she could not stop it. She knew that she could not protect her son from the pull of war, just as she could not protect Demetrius from the things that had broken him. The price of war was too high, too insidious. It seeped into everything, the hearts of the men who fought it, the women who waited, and the children who grew up in its shadow, and Alecta realized with a heavy heart that there was no escaping it. No matter how hard she tried to hold on to the past, to the man Demetrius had once been, it was gone. All she could do now was wait and watch as the man she had loved and the son she had borne were slowly consumed by the very thing she had always feared. War had taken more than just their bodies. Taken their souls, and the price of that Alecta knew was something no one could ever truly pay. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Alecta felt herself slipping deeper into a silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. The house that had once been filled with warmth and laughter now felt hollow, empty in a way that no amount of activity could fill. Demetrius was physically present, but emotionally and mentally he had retreated into himself, locked away behind walls of weariness and war. It was as if the man she had once known, the man who had held her close and whispered promises of a life beyond battle, had disappeared into the man he had become, a soldier through and through. He spent his days sharpening his weapons, checking his armor, preparing for the next campaign. When he spoke to her, it was only out of necessity. His words were always short-clipped and distant. There was no more tenderness in his gaze, no more warmth in the way he held her. The quiet moments they once shared were gone, replaced by the harsh realities of war that seemed to consume him, body and soul. The room between them had grown wider, and Alecta felt herself growing smaller in its coldness, retreating into her own thoughts, where she could still hold on to the man she remembered, the man who had once been hers. She would sit for hours at the loom, her hands moving almost automatically, the rhythmic sound of the shuttle passing through the threads, the only thing that seemed to ground her in a world that had become increasingly unrecognizable. The loom had become her constant companion, a steady reminder of the life she had once known, a life that was slipping further and further away with every passing day. She had always found comfort in the repetition of her work, the steady pulling of threads, the slow and deliberate weaving of fabric, but now it felt like a reflection of her own life, a series of interconnected threads that seemed to pull in opposite directions, leading her toward a future she could neither control nor escape. The fabric she wove was beautiful, intricate, but there was a sense of inevitability in it, a sense that no matter how much care she took in its creation, it would still be bound by the same fate as everything else. Each thread she passed through the loom seemed to pull the others in, drawing them closer to an ending that could not be avoided. It was a feeling she knew all too well, the way fate seemed to weave its own tapestry, tying her to a destiny she had never chosen, never wanted. And now, as she worked the loom, she couldn't help but feel that it was weaving the threads of her own life, too, the life she had once shared with Demetrius, and the life she was about to lose with Leandros. Her thoughts turned to her son, and a deep, familiar ache settled in her chest. Leandros was growing up fast, too fast. He was no longer the child who had run at her heels, asking endless questions about the world, about the warriors who marched through their streets, about the battles that were waged far from their home. Now he stood taller than she, his broad shoulders and strong arms a testament to the boy he had become. His eyes, once filled with wonder, now carried a spark of determination. A fire that Alecta knew all too well was the same fire that had burned in Demetrius's heart, the same fire that had drawn him to war. Soon she knew it would be time for Leandros to join the warriors, just as every Spartan boy was expected to do. He was almost of age, and the pull of duty would soon call him, just as it had called his father before him. She could see it in the way he carried himself, in the way he watched the soldiers with admiration, with longing. He was already speaking of joining the army, of fighting for Sparta, of proving himself as a man. And Alecta, despite her deepest desires to keep him close, knew that there would be no stopping him. He was bound by the same fate that had bound Demetrius, bound by the traditions of their people, by the demands of a society that valued warriors above all else. Her fear for him was as deep and as wide as the sea. She feared what the war would do to him, just as it had done to Demetrius. She feared the loss of innocence, the way battle hardened a soul, the way it took something from a man that could never be returned. Demetrius had come back to her broken, his heart and mind scarred by the things he had seen and done. Alecta had spent so many nights lying beside him, listening to the quiet tremors in his breath, wondering if the man beside her would ever be the same again. And now it would be Leandros's turn. The same destiny awaited him, the same call to arms, the same path of battle and bloodshed. She had no say in the matter. Sparta was a place where warriors were made, where every man had his place and his duty. There was no room for escape, no room for weakness. To be Spartan was to be a warrior, and there was no alternative. No matter how much Alecta wanted to keep her son safe, to keep him with her in the quiet safety of their home, she knew that the time would come when he too would walk out that door and there would be no turning back. She sat at the loom and thought of how the threads before her seemed to mirror the very thoughts in her mind. The threads crossed and intertwined, each one pulling the others into place. And in that moment, Alecta could see it clearly. The loom was her life, the lives of those she loved, each thread leading to the same inevitable end. She could see how every choice, every step they took was leading them toward the same conclusion. There was no way out. No matter how carefully she tried to weave her future, it was already written, already determined. She thought of Demetrius, of how he had once spoken of peace, of a life beyond battle. She thought of the dreams they had shared, of the future they had envisioned for themselves. And then she thought of Leandros standing tall and proud, ready to take his place among the warriors, ready to fight for Sparta. Alecta could see it all, the pattern of their lives, the way their fates were intertwined, the way the loom of life was pulling them all toward the same end. And yet despite all of this, she could not help but wish for something different. She wished for a world where her son could grow up free from the burdens of war, where Demetrius could find peace, where she could have the life they had dreamed of, filled with quiet moments and simple joys. But that world was not the one they lived in. They lived in Sparta, where men were forged in the fires of battle, where the loom of fate was woven with blood and steel. The threads crossed before her one by one, each decision made leading them further down the path they could not escape. And Alecta, for all her love and all her fear, knew that the day would come when Leandros, like his father before him, would leave. It was inevitable. The loom would weave it just as it had woven Demetrius's fate, and just as it was weaving her own. She continued to work her hands, moving automatically as the threads of her life intertwined with those of her husband and son. The loom before her was both a comfort and a reminder. It was a reminder that, no matter how much she tried to hold on to the past, to the dreams of a life beyond battle, the future was already set. It was a reminder that there was no escaping the fate that awaited them all, no matter how much she wished otherwise. And yet as she wove, Alecta allowed herself one small hope that somewhere hidden in the fabric of their lives there might still be room for love. Perhaps it was a thread too small to see, too delicate to feel, but she clung to it nonetheless. For even in the face of the loom of fate, even in the midst of the war that threatened to consume them all, Alecta knew that love was the one thing that could not be entirely unraveled. It was the only thread that remained, no matter how tightly the world tried to pull it apart. The night seemed to stretch on forever, long and quiet, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire in the hearth, and the rhythmic sound of the shuttle moving through the loom. Alecta sat hunched over her work, her hands moving almost mechanically as the threads slipped through her fingers. She had become so used to the sound of the loom that it had become a constant companion, a way to distract herself from the weight of the world around her. Outside, the night air was sharp with the promise of winter, but inside the house the warmth of the fire offered a small comfort. The room, dimly lit by the flickering flames, seemed still, almost too still. Demetrius had gone off again for another of his long training sessions, sharpening his skills for the inevitable battles that awaited Sparta. She knew he would return late, his mind already occupied with strategies and plans, and once again she would be alone in the quiet of the house. Her thoughts drifted as they so often did now to Leandros. The boy who had once sat at her feet full of questions, eager to learn about the world beyond their small home, was no longer a boy. He had grown tall and strong, his body beginning to show the marks of the warrior he was expected to become. His broad shoulders and the set of his jaw made it clear that the child she had known was slipping away, replaced by a young man who seemed to carry the weight of his destiny on his shoulders. Alecta had known this day would come. She had always known deep down that her son would one day stand before her and say the words she had feared. Every mother of Sparta, every woman who had married a warrior, had lived with the knowledge that their sons would be called to fight. It was part of the fabric of their world, a truth that could not be escaped. But even knowing it, even preparing herself for it, did not make it easier. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, a soft tread across the stone floor that grew louder as he approached her. She didn't look up immediately, her hands still working the loom as though they could hold her in this moment, this last moment, before everything changed. But then she felt his presence beside her, felt the weight of his gaze upon her. She set the shuttle down slowly and turned to face him. Leandros stood in the doorway, his figure outlined by the dim light of the fire. His brow was furrowed, his face troubled, as though he were struggling with something heavy that he couldn't quite express. It was a look Alecta had seen before, the same one Demetrius had worn when he had left for war all those years ago. That same look of determination, of duty. "Mother," he began, his voice tentative as though he were unsure of her reaction. "I want to join the army." Alecta's heart seemed to freeze in her chest. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing the words spoken aloud felt like a blow. She had hoped foolishly that maybe Leandros would find another path, one that didn't lead to the bloodshed and chaos that had taken so much from their family. But there he was, standing before her, the words already out in the open. The weight of his decision sank into her like a stone in water. Her fingers tightened around the loom's handle as though she could grasp hold of the moment and hold on to it for just a little longer. Her mouth went dry, and for a moment she couldn't speak. "You're too young," she finally whispered, her voice small, barely audible in the quiet of the room. "You don't understand what it means," but Leandros was no longer a boy. Alecta could see that now. The child who had once looked to her for comfort, for answers, was gone. The boy who had dreamed of adventure, of a world beyond their home, had grown into a man with a fire in his eyes, a fire that reflected the very essence of Sparta itself, the fire that had burned in Demetrius's heart too. "I understand enough," he replied, his voice steady, unwavering. There was no hesitation in his words. "It is my duty. It is my place." Alecta's breath caught in her throat. Her heart ached, a deep, unbearable ache, as she looked at him. He was her son, the child she had carried within her, the boy she had raised with the hope of a life away from war. And now here he was, standing before her, ready to walk the same path Demetrius had walked, a path that would take him away from her, perhaps forever. Alecta closed her eyes for a moment, as though trying to block out the truth that was right in front of her. She felt a single tear slip down her cheek, its warmth a stark contrast to the coldness she felt inside. It was as if the world had suddenly shifted, as if the very ground beneath her feet had been pulled away. She had known this was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. "Leandros?" She whispered his name as if it might somehow bring him back, as if it might undo what was happening. But she knew it wouldn't. The words she wanted to say, the words that screamed from the depths of her heart, seemed to lodge themselves somewhere deep inside her. She wanted to tell him that there was another way, that he didn't have to follow in his father's footsteps, that there was so much more to life than the endless cycle of war. But she couldn't. She couldn't stop him. He was already too far gone. Sparta had already claimed him, just as it had claimed Demetrius, and just as it had claimed every man who had ever been born within its walls. Without a word, Alecta turned back to the loom. Her hands, though trembling, reached for the shuttle. The weight of the moment was suffocating, but she continued to weave. Her fingers moved mechanically, pulling the threads through the familiar rhythm, offering a small comfort in the face of everything that was unraveling around her. Leandros stood in silence, watching her. Alecta could feel his gaze on her, could feel the tension in the room, but she did not look up. She couldn't. She had to keep weaving, had to keep the thread moving, even as her heart twisted in her chest. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the loom, the soft hum of the threads passing through. And then, without a word, Leandros turned and left. She heard his footsteps echo in the stillness of the house, growing fainter as he walked away. And Alecta was left alone once more, the loom her only companion. The threads before her, a reflection of the tangled mess of emotions she could not sort through. As the sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, Alecta let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked down at the loom, her fingers still working, still moving, in the familiar rhythm. And for the first time in a long while, she realized that the threads of her fate and Leandros's were intertwined, just as the threads on the loom were. There was no stopping what had already begun. She could no longer protect him. She could no longer keep him from the same fate that had taken his father. The loom before her had already started weaving the pattern of his life just as it had woven the pattern of hers. There was no escaping it. No matter how much she wished otherwise, the threads of fate had already been cast, and now they would pull them all to their inevitable end. Alecta took a deep breath, a single tear slipping down her cheek, and she continued to weave. Leandros stood at the edge of the village, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the last remnants of twilight clung to the jagged outline of the hills. The sky above was painted in shades of deep purple and gray, a canvas of impending nightfall. He could hear the sound of clashing swords, the rhythmic thud of feet striking the earth, the sharp commands of the trainers echoing across the training ground. These sounds, once distant and foreign, now seemed a part of him alive, pulsing with an energy that surged through his veins. The warriors were preparing for the battles to come, the same battles that had drawn his father away all those years ago. Leandros took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. His hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, the cold steel heavy in his grip. His shield, strapped securely to his arm, weighed him down, a reminder of the duty that called him the duty that had always been his destiny. The armor on his chest felt like an extension of his body now, as familiar as his own skin. But beneath the weight of it, beneath the promise of honor and glory, something else stirred within him, a quiet, gnawing feeling that he couldn't quite place. The fire that burned in his chest, the same fire that had driven every Spartan warrior before him, was there. It pushed him forward, urging him to take his place among the men who had fought and bled for their city. He had been raised for this. His blood had been steeped in the stories of great warriors, of heroes who had sacrificed everything for the glory of Sparta. His father had been one of those warriors. But now, as Leandros stood there looking out over the village that had been his home, there was a part of him that longed for something else, something softer, something quieter. He had always known that he would fight, that he would leave, but now that the moment was finally here, it felt different. The weight of it felt heavier than he had imagined. Turning from the horizon, he glanced back toward the village, his eyes finding the familiar shape of their home. The small, humble house where he'd been born, where his mother had raised him. There was something about the house that had always been a part of him, a place of safety, of warmth. But that was all slipping away now, as if the very earth beneath his feet was slowly eroding, pulling him toward a new life, a life defined by bloodshed, by duty. Alecta was standing in the doorway, her figure framed by the fading light. Her hair, once dark and full, had begun to show streaks of silver, and her face was etched with lines that spoke of years spent waiting, of years spent in fear. There was no need for words between them. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the way her eyes seemed to search for something in him that she could no longer find. Her gaze was steady, but there was a tremor there, a vulnerability she could never quite conceal. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to slow around them, the sound of the warriors fading into a muted hum as the space between mother and son stretched out as wide and deep as the ocean. He knew what she wanted to say, what every mother of a warrior would say, "Don't go." But Alecta had never been one to beg. She had never tried to hold him back. She had always known this day would come, just as every mother in Sparta knew. Their children were born for this life. There was no escaping it. Leandros swallowed the lump that had formed in his throat, a deep ache settling in his chest. His mind was clouded with doubt, with 1,000 unspoken thoughts, but the words came out steady, even though they felt hollow, empty. "I'll return to you, Mother," he promised, though. A part of him wondered if the words were more for himself than for her. He had always heard the stories of warriors who had left and never come back. He had seen men go off to war only to return broken or not at all. The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it away. He had to. He had to be strong. Alecta's response was a silent nod. She didn't speak, but her eyes never left him. Her hands. Those hands that had held him as a child, those hands that had comforted him through every wound and scrape, trembled slightly as they gripped the loom. She was still working even now, even as he stood on the edge of leaving. It was as if she had found solace in the steady rhythm of her weaving, the constant motion of the shuttle passing through the threads. But in that moment, Leandros could see the pain in her eyes, the way her gaze softened, as though she were already saying goodbye. He took a step toward her, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift, pulling him back, urging him to stay. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when he had already made up his mind. The fire inside him burned brighter as he walked toward her, his boots heavy on the earth beneath him. He stood before her close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, but not close enough to reach out and hold her. He could see the unshed tears in her eyes, the pain that she was trying so hard to hide. Alecta's gaze flickered briefly to the loom in her hands, and for a moment, Leandros thought he saw a flash of something. Something broken, something worn, but it was gone before he could fully understand it. Her hands slowly released their grip on the loom, and she stepped back slightly, her posture rigid as if she were preparing for something. Leandros reached out his hand, brushing lightly against her arm. It was a fleeting gesture, a moment of connection in the silence that had settled between them. "I'll make you proud," he said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside him, though they sounded empty even to his own ears. Alecta didn't respond immediately, and for a long moment they stood there, suspended in the quiet, the weight of everything between them too heavy for words to carry. Finally, Alecta spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I know you will," she said, but there was a sadness in her tone that made his chest tighten. She had always been strong, always had the courage to face the harsh realities of their world, but now, as she looked at him, there was something in her eyes that he couldn't quite read. Was it fear? Was it regret? Or was it simply love, a love so deep, so overwhelming that it had become too much to bear? And then, without another word, she turned away from him, back toward the loom. Her fingers hesitated for a moment, as though she were unsure of what to do next, and then, with a heavy sigh, she resumed her work. The shuttle slid through the threads, the motion slow and deliberate, the sound of the loom almost comforting in the stillness of the room. Leandros stood there for a moment longer, watching her, watching the quiet rhythm of her work, and then, without another glance, he turned and walked away. As he passed through the village, his heart ached with the knowledge that this might be the last time he would ever see his mother in the doorway of their home, the last time he would feel the warmth of her presence. The thought of it was too much to bear, but he pushed it down. This was his duty. This was his place. The fire that burned in him was too strong to ignore. The weight of the armor on his shoulders seemed to grow heavier with each step, but he carried it nonetheless. The weight of Sparta's legacy, the weight of his family's history, the weight of his own future. He walked toward the training grounds, the sound of swords clashing, ringing in his ears. The call of duty pulling him forward just as it had pulled his father before him. And as the village grew smaller behind him, Leandros knew that the journey ahead would be long and dangerous. He knew there would be bloodshed, loss, and perhaps even death. But there was no turning back now. He had taken his first step into the unknown, and there was no place for him to go but forward. Days blurred into one another, and Alecta found herself sitting in the same place she had occupied for so many years, the quiet, dimly lit corner of their home, where the loom stood as both a symbol of her work and a reminder of her solitude. The rhythmic motion of her hands pulling the shuttle through the threads was the only sound that accompanied her. It was a steady, almost mechanical rhythm, one that she had perfected over time. Each pass of the shuttle through the fabric felt like a quiet rebellion against the world outside, against the relentless march of time, the unyielding presence of war, and the emptiness that had settled in her heart since Leandros left. She had long ago grown accustomed to the silence in the house, but now in the aftermath of his departure, it felt different. The quiet seemed heavier, suffocating in a way it had never been before. The absence of his footsteps, the sound of his voice, the familiar presence of her son in the room left an emptiness she couldn't fill. She could still see his face before he left, his eyes full of determination, the weight of his decision pressing down on him even as he tried to reassure her with his promises. "I'll return, Mother," he had said, but the words, though spoken with the conviction of a young man determined to fulfill his duty, echoed hollow in her memory now. Leandros had gone just as so many other sons had, marching off to battle in the name of Sparta. The battlefield had called to him just as it had called to his father before him, and now Alecta was left alone, once more caught in the silence that followed. The loom before her, the threads crossing and weaving together, seemed to reflect the tangled emotions in her heart. She had always found comfort in her work, in the quiet focus that weaving required. But now it felt as though the very act of weaving was an act of resistance. With every pull of the thread, she silently protested the world that had led them here to this moment. The rhythm of the loom was a silent protest against the noise of the world outside, a world that seemed to be spinning out of control. She couldn't stop thinking of the lives lost, the families torn apart, the endless cycle of violence that had claimed her husband, and now it seemed would claim her son as well. The past was a constant weight on her shoulders, pressing down with memories she couldn't shake. She remembered the times before the war, before duty had taken Demetrius from her, when they would sit together in the evenings, speaking softly of their hopes and dreams for the future. They had once imagined a life of peace, a life where their son would grow up free from the call to arms, a life where their family could live in quiet contentment. But those dreams were shattered, just like the threads of her weaving unraveling in the face of duty. "Is this our fate?" she wondered aloud one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air unanswered, as though the loom itself might offer a response. But there was no answer, only the steady click of the shuttle moving through the fabric. It felt as though her entire life had been woven into the same pattern, one of sacrifice, of loss, and of an unending cycle of war. Was this really the life they were meant to lead? Was there no other way? The question plagued her mind, and no matter how many times she asked it, she could find no answer. She had always believed that there was something more to life than the constant call to war. She had dreamed of a different future, a future where her son would not have to follow in the footsteps of his father, where he would not have to sacrifice himself for the glory of Sparta. But now, as she sat alone with her loom, she began to wonder if that future had ever truly been possible. Had she been foolish to hope for a life that was never meant to be? Had they as a family been doomed from the start, bound by the unyielding traditions of their people, destined to repeat the same pattern of war and loss? Alecta's hands paused on the loom, her fingers trembling slightly as she thought of Demetrius. She remembered the man he had been before the war, the man who had once spoken of peace, of a future beyond battle. He had been strong, full of hope, with dreams of a world where their son could grow up free from the bloodshed that had defined their lives. But those dreams had been swept away, consumed by the fire of war. The man she had loved had returned to her a shadow of himself, a man who had seen too much, done too much, and could no longer find his way back to the life they had once envisioned. In her heart, Alecta knew that Demetrius had never wanted this life for her, for their family. He had left her with a promise to return to build a life together after the war was over. But promises, she had learned, were fragile things. They were words empty and fleeting in the face of duty. And now, even as Leandros prepared to follow in his father's footsteps, Alecta couldn't help but feel the weight of that broken promise once more. She turned her thoughts back to Leandros. It had been weeks since he left, but it felt like a lifetime. His absence was a constant ache in her chest, a reminder of what had been lost. He had been her world, the center of her life, and now in his absence she was left to wonder if she had failed him. Had she done enough to protect him from the harsh realities of the world? Had she done enough to prepare him for the life that awaited him? And most painfully of all, had she given him the strength to face the horrors of war without losing himself in the process? She thought of the day he had left, of the way he had stood before her, his face full of resolve, his eyes burning with the fire of Sparta. She had wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him that she couldn't bear to lose him, just as she had lost his father, but she had said nothing. She had simply nodded, her heart breaking in silence. She knew that the decision was not hers to make. The call of duty had already claimed him just as it had claimed Demetrius. There was no escaping it. There was no way to protect him from the fate that awaited all Spartan warriors. But as the days passed, Alecta found herself questioning everything. Was this really the life they were meant to live? Was there no other way? She had tried to hold on to hope, to believe that one day their family would be free of the war that had torn them apart. But the longer she sat at the loom, weaving the threads of her thoughts into the fabric, the more she realized that hope was slipping through her fingers just as the threads of her weaving slipped through the shuttle. The world outside, the world of war and bloodshed, was too powerful, too ingrained in the fabric of their society. There was no escaping it. As the loom's rhythm continued, Alecta's mind wandered to the question she had asked earlier. Is this our fate? She had no answer, only the steady sound of the shuttle passing through the fabric. The threads, each one interwoven with the others, seemed to mirror the lives of the people around her, interconnected, yet ultimately pulled in different directions by the demands of duty, of fate, of history. The tapestry of their lives was being woven thread by thread, and there was nothing she could do to change the pattern. Her hands moved again, her fingers pressing the shuttle through the threads with mechanical precision. It was all she could do. The loom had become her refuge, her only constant in a world that was slipping further and further from her control. The quiet protest of the loom was all she had left, all she could hold on to in the face of everything that was beyond her reach. As the last threads of the evening light disappeared from the sky, Alecta sat in the silence of the room, the loom before her, and the emptiness of the house surrounding her. She couldn't stop the tears that filled her eyes, though she made no sound. She had given everything to the life she had chosen, and now in the quiet aftermath she was left with nothing but the loom, the threads, and the weight of the silence that hung in the air. And in the stillness she wondered if this was truly her fate, or if it was just the way things had always been meant to be. The door creaked open on a cool, quiet evening, and Alecta's heart skipped a beat. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it carried with it a weight that settled in her chest like a stone. She wasn't sure how long she'd been sitting there, waiting, the loom in front of her still and untouched, its rhythmic hum now replaced by the heavy silence of the room. She had been waiting for this moment, for him to come home for so long. And yet now that it was finally here, the reality of it felt more like a dream, something just beyond her reach. Demetrius stepped through the doorway, his movements slow, deliberate. He was back. After months of uncertainty, after the long, agonizing wait that had stretched her spirit thinner with each passing day, he had returned. But the man who stood before her was not the man who had left. Alecta's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight of him. His once proud armor was now a patchwork of dented metal and worn leather, evidence of countless battles fought, of years of conflict that had claimed more than just his body. His face, once strong and full of life, was now hardened, scarred by time and the brutality of war. His eyes, those eyes she had once loved, full of warmth and promise, were now distant, hollow. It was as if the battles he had fought had carved something indelible into his soul, something that could never be undone. His gaze met hers, but it was not the gaze of the man she remembered. It was cold, as though he had been lost to her long ago. Alecta rose from her seat slowly, her heart heavy with a mixture of relief and fear. She had waited for this moment, but now that it was here, she didn't know what to say, what to do. Her fingers brushed against the loom, the same loom that had kept her company through all the long months, but even it felt distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. Demetrius stepped into the room, his movements stiff, his body taut with the tension of unspoken words. He didn't speak right away, just stood there in the doorway, taking in the familiar surroundings. It was as if he, too, was unsure of where he belonged. The years of war, of separation, had created a gap between them that neither of them knew how to bridge. Finally, Demetrius moved toward the chair Alecta had offered him. His posture was rigid, as if he had forgotten how to relax, how to rest. He lowered himself into the chair, the weight of his exhaustion settling in with the same force as his armor. Alecta watched him, her heart breaking as she saw how different he was, how the years of fighting had chipped away at the man she had once known. The silence stretched out between them thick and heavy, a barrier neither knew how to cross. Alecta stood there waiting, but unsure of what to say. She had so many questions, so many things she wanted to know, but they all felt like too much to ask. How could she break the silence when the weight of everything between them was so vast? It was Demetrius who spoke first, his voice hoarse as though it had been unused for far too long. "Did you hear of Leandros?" His question hung in the air, sharp and sudden, cutting through the tension. Alecta's heart clenched at the mention of their son. She had heard, of course. She had heard of Leandros's bravery, of the battles he had fought, of the men he had killed. The stories had filtered back to her through letters and whispers, each one a reminder of the boy she had once held in her arms, the boy who was now a warrior. "Yes," she said softly, her voice betraying a hint of sorrow, though she tried to keep it steady. She had to be strong for him, for Leandros. "I have heard of his bravery." She could feel the knot in her chest tighten, the ache that had never quite gone away. Her son had left just as Demetrius had, and now he was caught in the same cycle, the same relentless march of battle. Was this the life they were all condemned to live? Were they all doomed to fight and die for a city that valued warriors above all else? "He'll return," she said, though the words felt uncertain, fragile, like they might shatter at any moment. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to Demetrius or to herself. But Demetrius only shook his head, his eyes darkening as he looked at her. "No one returns unchanged," he said, his voice thick with the weight of his own experience. His words were quiet, but they carried a truth that hit Alecta like a blow. War takes more than bodies. It takes hearts, too. Alecta's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment the world around her seemed to blur. She closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She had always feared that war would take more than just Demetrius, that it would take something from him that could never be returned. She had seen it in his eyes, when he returned from battle, the emptiness that lingered there, the shadows of the man he used to be. And now standing before her, he was telling her the same thing he had never been able to say before. No one who goes to war can come back whole. Alecta took a slow, shaky breath, forcing herself to focus on the present, on the man before her. Demetrius, her husband, the father of her son, the man she had once loved with all her heart. He was still here, but he was not the same. She had known it, felt it in the very marrow of her bones, but hearing him say it aloud made the truth undeniable. She couldn't protect Leandros from this either. She couldn't protect him from the storm that had already taken Demetrius, and now it would take him too. "I know," she whispered, the words coming out ragged. "I know Demetrius." He looked at her, then really looked at her as though seeing her for the first time in years. His gaze softened just for a moment before it became distant once more. It was as though he were fighting some inner battle, struggling to find the man he once was, the man who had walked out of their home full of promises, full of hope. But that man had been lost in the years of war, and the man who stood before her now was a stranger, someone who had survived the brutal reality of battle, but who had left a part of himself behind on the field. Alecta didn't know what to say. How could she? The silence between them stretched on, suffocating, until she could bear it no longer. She moved toward him, her hands trembling, and placed a gentle hand on his. He didn't pull away, but his fingers didn't curl around hers either. It was an empty gesture, one that felt like a fragile thread between two people who had once been so close, but now were worlds apart. "I never wanted this for you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I never wanted this for either of you." Demetrius looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. He said nothing for a long time, and Alecta wasn't sure if he had even heard her. But then finally he spoke, his voice quieter now, tinged with a bitterness that had long since settled into his soul. "I know," he said simply, "I know." The words hung between them, a quiet understanding passing in the stillness. They were two people who had once dreamed of a life beyond the battlefield, beyond the war that had consumed their lives, but now they were both bound to the same fate. Alecta felt the weight of that truth press down on her chest. She had known it deep down that there was no escaping it. The war had already claimed her husband, and now it was claiming her son. She could see it in Leandros' eyes, the same fire, the same drive to prove himself, to earn his place among the warriors. And she knew with a sickening certainty that there was no way to shield him from the fate that awaited him. The weight of silence returned heavier now, filling the room between them. Alecta's hands remained on Demetrius's, though the connection between them felt fragile, as though it might break with the slightest touch. "Do you think there will ever be a time," she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "when we can be free of this?" Demetrius looked at her. Then his eyes searching hers, as though trying to find the answers that neither of them had. And for a moment, in the silence that stretched between them, they both knew that the answer was no. There would never be a time when they were free of this. War had claimed them body and soul, and there was no escaping it. The door was still open, the sounds of the world outside drifting in, of warriors training, of the clang of swords, of the harsh reality of the world they lived in. Alecta closed her eyes, and for a fleeting moment she wished for something else, for a life where her family could be whole again, where peace wasn't just a dream. But as the night wore on and Demetrius sat in the chair before her, there was no escaping the truth. The world had already woven their fate, and there was nothing left to do but to face it together. Time continued to slip away each day, blurring indistinctly into the next. The seasons shifted imperceptibly, and though the world outside continued its relentless march, inside Alecta's home time seemed to freeze in place. The loom before her was her only constant, its rhythmic hum, a steady reminder of the life she had once known, a life now fractured beyond repair. Her hands moved tirelessly as they always had, but her heart, her very soul, seemed to have stopped altogether. She wove the threads, each one an effort to bind herself to the present, to hold on to some semblance of control. The fabric grew piece by piece, but no matter how much she worked, no matter how many hours passed in quiet solitude, the emptiness inside her remained. The shuttle passed through the loom one thread at a time, but with each passing day, the ache of waiting for her son Leandros to return gnawed at her. She had heard nothing from him, no letters, no word. The silence was suffocating. The longer it stretched on, the more it felt like a fracture in the very fabric of her existence. The weight of the silence grew, filling every corner of the house that had once been warm with laughter and the presence of her family. Now it was just the echo of memories fading with each passing moment. She would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, wondering where her son was, what he was doing, if he was still alive. She clung to the hope that one day a letter would arrive or the door would open and Leandros would walk back through it. But the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, and still there was nothing. Demetrius, too, had become more distant, though he was physically present. His return from the battlefield had marked a change in him that Alecta could not ignore. The man who had once left her with promises of peace, with dreams of a future beyond war, was gone. The soldier who returned was hardened, distant, and worn. He had spent too many years fighting, too many years drowning in the brutality of war. The fire in his eyes that had once been filled with hope was now clouded with darkness. His gaze had grown sharp, unfocused, as though he were seeing things that Alecta could not see, things he could not share. Where once there had been tenderness, there was now a coldness. He spoke little of his time on the front lines, though Alecta could see the scars, both visible and invisible, that war had left on him. His hands, once strong and gentle, now trembled at times when he thought she wasn't looking. His temper had grown more volatile, like a storm always threatening to break. He would lash out over the smallest things and then retreat into himself as though the rage had consumed him. Alecta, despite all her love, could not reach him. He had become a stranger in their own home, a shadow of the man she had once known. She wondered with a quiet, relentless fear whether this was the price of war. The price they had both paid, though she had never raised a sword, never stepped onto the battlefield. She had watched Demetrius change before her eyes, seen how the war had torn him apart, and now as she sat alone weaving the fabric of her life, she feared the same fate awaited their son. Leandros had not yet returned from the battlefield, and Alecta found herself paralyzed by the knowledge that the man her son would be when he returned would not be the same man who had left. He would carry the same scars, the same invisible wounds that Demetrius bore, and the price of war would claim him just as it had claimed his father. It terrified her to think of it. She had always known that war was a part of Sparta. She had always known that their lives would be shaped by it, that the men they loved would go to battle, that their sons would one day follow in their footsteps. But she had never truly understood the cost, never truly comprehended the toll it would take on her, on their family. The pain of watching Demetrius slip away, of seeing the man she loved transform into someone she didn't recognize, had been unbearable. But it was nothing compared to the fear of what awaited Leandros. He was still a boy in many ways, though he had become a man in others. He was strong, brave, eager to prove himself. But how would war change him? How could it not? She thought of the day he had left, of the promises he had made to her. "I'll return, mother," he had said, his voice filled with conviction, but even then Alecta had known. She had known that no one who left for war could return unchanged, not Demetrius and not Leandros. She had feared it, but now the reality of it was settling in like a heavy stone in her chest. War did not just take lives, it took hearts, it took souls, and she feared that her son would return to her a shadow of the boy he had once been. She thought of the men she had seen come back from battle over the years, men whose faces had been hollow, whose eyes had been distant, whose spirits had been broken. Some returned with their bodies intact, but with the light inside them gone, as though the war had stripped away everything that made them human. Others returned physically wounded, bearing the scars of battle on their skin. But the scars that ran deeper, the ones that could not be seen, were the ones that had torn them apart from the inside. Demetrius had returned with those scars, and Alecta feared that her son would too. She had always feared this, for Leandros feared the day when the world would call him to war, when he would be forced to make the choice his father had made and walk away from the safety of their home, leaving behind the warmth of family for the cold reality of the battlefield. But she had never imagined it would be like this. She had never imagined that the boy she had raised, the boy who had once held her hand and looked up to her with trust and innocence, would be consumed by the fire of war just as his father had been. Alecta's hands moved once more, but the weaving felt different now. It was as though the fabric she created no longer held meaning. Each thread was a repetition of the same cycle, the same pattern. The shuttle passed through the strands, but it felt empty. The loom that had once been her refuge now felt like a reflection of her own life, a life that had become a series of repeated motions, a series of losses that could never be undone. The sound of the shuttle moving through the fabric was the only thing that broke the silence. It was a steady rhythm, a reminder of time's passage, but it no longer comforted her. The silence in her home was overwhelming. Demetrius was there physically present, but his mind was elsewhere, lost to the horrors of war. Leandros was gone, and she didn't know if he would return at all, or if he did, whether he would still be the boy she had sent away. The weight of it all was too much for Alecta to bear. The price of war was steep, and it was not just paid in blood. It was paid in broken families, in shattered dreams, in lives that were irrevocably changed by the choices made on the battlefield. The loom before her seemed to capture the essence of it all, the endless cycle of sacrifice and loss. She couldn't escape it. No one could. And so she wove. She wove through the pain, through the silence, through the weight of the world that pressed down on her chest. She wove the threads of her life, her family's life, into the fabric of fate, knowing that no matter how hard she tried, she could never escape the toll that war had taken on them all. Alecta sat motionless by the hearth, the low crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. The warmth from the flames barely touched her skin, and yet she felt cold to the bone. The house around her seemed to close in the walls, pressing in on her as the night stretched long deeper than it ever had before. She had not slept, nor could she. Sleep had become a foreign concept, a luxury that her mind, too frantic with worry, refused to afford her. Instead, she sat her gaze fixed on the flickering flames, as though they might hold some answer to the storm raging inside her heart. Weeks had passed since Demetrius's return, yet each day seemed heavier than the last. He had come back with the same weariness in his eyes, his soul heavy with the weight of battle, but at least he was home. He had returned, though he was a stranger to her in so many ways. The silence between them had become a suffocating cloak wrapped tightly around them both, one that neither seemed able to shake off. He rarely spoke, only offering the occasional word or grunt, and she had learned to live with it as she had learned to live with the absence of so many things over the years. But the silence that settled around her, suffocating her, had become unbearable. There was something even worse than the silence, something that clawed at her heart each day, each hour. It was the silence of Leandros' absence. For weeks there had been no word, no letters. Alecta had sent her letters hoping that they would reach him, that they would find their way to the battlefield and bring back even a shred of reassurance. But they had returned unopened, their edges frayed with the passage of time. She had sent them again and again, but there was still no reply, no sign of him, nothing. Her heart clenched each time she thought of him. It was as though the world had swallowed him whole, leaving her with nothing but the echo of his absence. The sound of his voice, once so familiar, was now a memory she could hardly grasp. The boy she had raised, the boy who had once looked at her with wonder and love, was now a man somewhere far from her, caught in the same cycle of war that had taken his father away. The terror of never hearing from him again settled in her chest like a stone weighing her down. The silence of the house was oppressive. It had once been a comfort, a place of peace where she could retreat from the world. But now it felt like an unbearable weight, an emptiness she could not escape. The days stretched on, and she began to feel the creeping fear of something far worse than loneliness, something deeper, something she couldn't name. Her fingers traced the edge of the loom in front of her, a familiar action, but it didn't bring her the same sense of peace it once had. She couldn't find solace in her work anymore. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting shadows that danced on the walls, but the warmth seemed distant. The heat of the flames couldn't touch the coldness that had settled inside her. She thought of the love she had for Leandros, the fierce protection that had been born within her the moment he had been placed in her arms. It was a love that had never wavered, not when Demetrius had left to fight, not when the war had taken them both from her. She had watched Demetrius walk away, and for all the pain that had caused it had been nothing compared to the terror that gripped her now, the fear of losing her son. When Leandros had been small, she had held him close, wrapped him in her arms, and whispered promises to him, promises of safety, of a world where love and peace could endure. But the years had stolen that dream. The world had stolen that dream. Her love had never faltered, but it could not shield him from what lay beyond the door, from the pull of the battlefield, from the unrelenting call to arms that awaited every Spartan son. The war that had taken Demetrius had now reached for Leandros, and Alecta had no way of stopping it. She knew that now. The cold truth had settled in her heart, a truth she had always known but never fully accepted. Her love, fierce and unyielding, had never been enough to protect him. Love alone could not hold back the tides of fate. The thought sent a chill through her. She wanted to shout, to scream at the injustice of it all, but her voice would not come. Instead, she sat there, still watching the flames. She was a mother, a woman who had given everything for her family, for the hope of a future where they could all live in peace. And yet here she was, alone, her son lost to her, and the man she had once loved slipping further away each day. Alecta stood suddenly, her feet carrying her across the room with a quiet urgency, as if the act of moving might somehow shake off the feeling of helplessness that had settled over her. She walked to the loom as she always did when her mind became too heavy to bear. Her fingers found the shuttle, the familiar weight of it grounding her, even if for just a moment. She began to weave slowly, at first, her motions careful, measured, as though each movement of her hands could somehow fix the brokenness she felt inside. Each pull of the thread was a prayer, a desperate plea for Leandros' safe return, for the future that had once seemed possible before war had taken root in their lives. Her hands moved with a kind of determination, now pulling the shuttle through the threads with purpose. Each movement was like a promise, a hope, a plea that things could be different, that she could somehow change the course of their fate. She wove the hopes of her ancestors into the fabric, the dreams of a life unmarked by war. She wove the memories of peace, of a time when she and Demetrius had spoken of the future with dreams of a better world for their son. She wove the hopes of a future where Leandros would not have to face the same choices that had torn his father apart. With every pull of the shuttle, Alecta whispered her love into the loom, as though the fabric itself might carry it to her son wherever he was. She wove the stories of their family stories, of laughter, of joy, of the small moments that had once made their life whole. She wove those memories into the fabric, threading them through the loom like a lifeline. She wove the future she still dreamed of, even as it seemed to slip further away with each passing day. But no matter how much she wove, no matter how many threads she pulled through, the silence remained. The loom, once a comforting presence, now seemed to mock her, the rhythmic motion of the shuttle, a reminder that she could never escape the reality of their lives. Leandros was out there somewhere, lost in the chaos of war, and there was nothing she could do but wait. Alecta paused, her hand trembling as she looked down at the fabric she had created. It was beautiful, intricate, a reflection of everything she had hoped for. And yet as she touched the threads, she felt the weight of it all, the weight of her son's absence, the weight of the war, the weight of the love she had for him and for Demetrius. It was a love that had never wavered, even in the face of the darkest days. But now, in the quiet of the room, she wondered if love was enough. Could love ever be enough to protect them from the storm that had already claimed so much? Her fingers brushed the fabric once more, and for a brief moment she closed her eyes, lost in the rhythm of the loom. She wove, hoping, praying that somehow it would carry her son back to her, that somehow the threads of fate would pull him home. The shuttle passed through the loom, the sound filling the room as though the very act of weaving could shape the world. Each thread was a part of her, each movement a reflection of her heart. And with every pass, Alecta held onto one final hope, that love in the end would be enough to bring her family back together. The door creaked open, a sound Alecta had come to dread, for it was both familiar and foreign at once. Her heart leapt in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She had waited for this moment, for the return of her son, for the reunion she had dreamed of in the long, sleepless nights. But as she looked up from her work, the sight before her made her freeze, as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. There he stood, framed by the dim light from the doorway, a figure so altered that it took Alecta a moment to recognize him. Leandros, her son. But the boy she had sent off, eager and strong, was no longer standing before her. The fire that had once burned so brightly in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something far darker, something she couldn't fully understand. The light that had once made him her hope was gone, and in its place was an emptiness that seemed to stretch beyond the walls of their home. His body was battered. His armor, once gleaming and proud, was dented and stained with blood. But it wasn't just the blood on his skin that made her heart ache. It was the emptiness in his posture, in the way he stood there, broken and distant. His shoulders were slumped, weighed down by something far heavier than the armor he wore. His hands were clenched into fists, not in readiness for battle, but as though he were fighting some unseen enemy, something that had taken root deep inside him. Alecta's feet moved before she could even think the instinct to reach her son, overriding everything else. She rushed toward him, her hands trembling as they reached for his face, her fingers trembling against his skin as if trying to reconnect the pieces of him that had been lost. The boy who had been her world, the child she had held in her arms, the young man who had once looked at her with hope, with dreams, was gone. What stood before her now was a stranger. "Leandros," she whispered, her voice breaking, fragile and desperate. Her hands cupped his face, but he didn't react. He didn't even flinch. "My son, what has happened to you?" Her words were soft, like a prayer, but they carried with them a weight that seemed too heavy for him to bear. She felt her breath catch in her chest, her heart shattering with each second that passed. He had returned, yes, but he was not the son she had sent away. Leandros turned his head slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. But even as he looked at her, it was as though he wasn't really seeing her, or perhaps seeing a version of her that was too far removed from the present. There was no recognition in his gaze. It was distant, lost hollow. She saw only a shadow of the boy she had loved, the boy who had been filled with dreams and promises. "Leandros," she repeated, as though the name might pull him back from the abyss that had claimed him. But he didn't speak. His lips remained tight, his expression unreadable, as though every word she had ever said to him had fallen away, leaving behind only the silence of what he had experienced. Alecta's chest tightened, her heart breaking all over again, as she realized that the boy she had sent away was no longer there. The child she had raised, the boy who had laughed with her, who had asked about the world, who had hoped for a future filled with peace, he was gone. What was left in his place was someone unrecognizable, someone who had been shaped and altered by the horrors of war. Someone who had been broken by the weight of what he had seen and done. Tears blurred her vision, but she could not stop herself from reaching for him, from desperately trying to bridge the gap that had grown between them. She had always been able to comfort him, to hold him close, to calm the storms that raged inside him. But now, with him standing before her, so distant, so lost, she realized that she couldn't reach him anymore. The gulf between them was too wide, too deep to cross. "Leandros," she whispered again this time, her voice filled with something like sorrow and helplessness. "Where are you? What has happened to you?" He finally blinked his eyes, shifting ever so slightly as though something deep within him was struggling to surface. But the moment was fleeting. The darkness returned to his gaze, and Alecta felt the shiver of fear creep up her spine. He had come home, yes, but he was not home. Not truly. His body had returned, but his soul, his spirit seemed to be lost in the shadows of war, a place where she could not follow. Leandros shifted his weight slightly, his hands still clenched into fists. He stepped back, his eyes never leaving hers. His lips parted, but the words that came out were not the ones she had expected, not the words she had hoped for. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough, a mere rasp compared to the strong, confident voice she remembered. The apology, if that's what it was, seemed inadequate, a fraction of what needed to be said. Alecta's heart twisted at the sound of it, at how hollow it felt. He wasn't sorry for the way he had changed. He was sorry for the thing he had become. She knew that. He was sorry for the part of him that had died on the battlefield, for the part of him that could never be returned to her. Alecta took a step back, trying to steady herself, her knees threatening to buckle under the weight of it all. She had imagined this moment so many times, the day her son would return, when she would see him walk through the door, strong and whole again, ready to pick up where they had left off. But this was not what she had imagined. This was not the reunion she had hoped for. "Leandros," she said, the words heavy with the weight of all she could not say. She stepped toward him again, reaching out, but the distance between them, both physical and emotional, seemed too much to bridge. She hesitated, her hands trembling as they hovered in the air, unsure of whether to touch him again. He didn't move, didn't respond. Alecta finally dropped her hands, her shoulders sagging under the burden of her helplessness. She had wanted to save him, to shield him from the horrors of the world. But she knew deep down that she could not. She could not protect him from what war had taken from him, from what it had taken from her. She looked at him one last time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, my son, come back to me." But the words didn't reach him. They hung in the air, lost and swallowed by the space between them, the space that had grown too wide for love to reach across. Leandros's expression didn't change. He stood before her, a shadow of the boy he had once been, and for the first time Alecta realized that this was the price of war. It wasn't just the lives lost, the bodies returned broken. It was the way it carved into the very soul of a person, the way it stripped them of their humanity and left something behind that could never be fully reclaimed. The silence stretched on heavy and thick as Alecta stood in the dim light of the room watching her son, the boy who had once been her world standing before her, lost. Leandros hardly spoke. For days on end he would sit by the hearth staring into the flames with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. His gaze was fixed distant, as if the fire in front of him was not the warmth of home, but something darker, a reminder of the battles he had fought and the things he had seen. Alecta watched him in silence, her heart breaking in pieces as she saw the boy she had raised, the child she had nurtured, disappear behind the eyes of a stranger. The boy who had once run through their home laughing, asking questions, eager to learn, was now gone, replaced by a man whose silence spoke louder than any words could. Alecta tried again and again to reach him, to pull him back from the depths of the darkness that seemed to have consumed him. She would speak to him gently, asking how he was, what weighed on his heart, but he would merely look at her, his expression unreadable, his eyes hollow. There was no recognition in them, not the boy she had known, not the young man who had once been filled with fire and dreams of the future. Instead, there was only emptiness, a chasm that stretched between them too wide to bridge. She would try to hold him, but it felt like holding air, like her hands were slipping through his body, unable to make contact with the person he had become. His form was still there, his shoulders broad, his body strong, but inside something was missing. Alecta had always prided herself on being a mother who could protect her son, who could shield him from harm. But she had learned painfully that there were some things a mother could not protect her child from. The war had taken Leandros in a way she had never imagined it would. He was alive, but a part of him had been buried, left behind on the battlefield, and no amount of love or care could bring it back. In the evenings, when the firelight flickered across the walls, Alecta would watch him from the corner of her eye. His posture was always the same, slumped as though the weight of his own thoughts was too much to bear. He sat there barely moving, as though the world around him had ceased to exist. Sometimes he would glance at her, but it wasn't with the look of a son who sought comfort from his mother. It was distant cold, like she was just another figure in his peripheral vision. She wondered in the quietest part of her mind if he even remembered the way they had once been. It was as if the boy she had known had been swallowed by something too vast, too dark to understand. The war had left its mark on him in ways that she couldn't even begin to comprehend. And each time she tried to reach him, to speak to him, to break through that distance, it was like she was trying to touch a shadow, something that would slip away the moment her hands drew near. But it wasn't just Leandros who had changed. Demetrius, too, had grown more withdrawn in the weeks since his return. Though he was physically present in the house, his mind was somewhere far away. Alecta could see it in his eyes, those once vibrant eyes that had always been filled with love for her, for their family were now empty, clouded with things he could not or would not share. He had returned from the battlefield broken in ways she hadn't fully realized until now. The same battles that had claimed their son's spirit seemed to have taken something from him too. He had once been her strength, the man she had shared everything with, but now he was distant, a shell of the man she had married. It wasn't that he had turned cruel or unkind, no. He was still the man she had known, in many ways soft-spoken, gentle when he chose to be. But there was an absence in him now, a distance that kept her at arm's length. The man who had once filled their home with laughter, with talk of the future, was gone. In his place was a man who rarely spoke of anything that mattered, who seemed incapable of truly connecting with her or with their son. There were moments when she would catch him looking at her, his face softening, as if he longed to say something, to reach out, but then it would fade again. The moment would pass, and they would both retreat back into their respective silences. It was as though he, too, had been lost to the war. She could see the scars in his movements, the weariness that clung to him like a second skin. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled when he tried to hold a cup of water or when he reached for something on the table. He spoke little of his experiences, nothing beyond the necessary details. The long days and nights in battle, the people he had met, the men who had fought beside him, the faces of the fallen. All of it was locked away behind a wall. He had built a wall that Alecta could not breach. The silence between them, like the silence between her and Leandros, became a weight in their home, one that they all carried, but never spoke of. She could see the bond forming between them, the bond of shared trauma, of battle and blood. But it was not the kind of bond that healed. It was a bond that left scars. Demetrius and Leandros were two men forged in the fire of war, but Alecta was not sure if that bond was one that could ever bring them closer. She feared that the damage done to them both was irreparable, and so she watched them both, helpless. Demetrius and Leandros, once the center of her world, were slipping away from her in ways she couldn't stop. The war had taken so much from them, too much. It had changed them, altered them in ways that Alecta could not fathom. And though she loved them with every fiber of her being, she couldn't undo what had been done. She couldn't bring them back to her, not in the way she had hoped. Leandros' silence grew more pronounced, Demetrius' presence more distant, and Alecta's heart grew heavier each day as she tried to hold on to the fragments of the family she once had, knowing deep down that there were parts of them she would never get back. One evening after dinner, Alecta found herself alone in the house once more. Leandros had retreated to his corner, and Demetrius had gone to bed early, as he often did. She sat by the fire, staring into the flames, the glow of the embers casting shadows on the walls. Her thoughts swirled in a quiet storm, and she wondered what the future would hold. Could they ever return to the life they once had? Would the war always be a part of them, an invisible force pulling at their hearts, at their spirits? Breaking them little by little, could the love she had for her family be enough to mend? What had been torn apart, Alecta's fingers traced the edge of the loom, the familiar motion offering no comfort now. She had woven countless tapestries throughout her life, but each thread seemed to be a reminder that there was no escaping the burden of change. Her family had been torn apart by forces they could not control, and all she could do was watch as the remnants of what they once were slipped further and further from her grasp. As the fire burned low, casting a soft glow over her tired face, she couldn't help but feel the weight of it all, the weight of the changes in the men she loved, the weight of the silence between them, the weight of the world outside that had taken everything from them. All she had left was her love for them, and even that she feared might not be enough to heal the wounds that had been inflicted by war. The weeks had stretched into months, each day blurring indistinctly into the next, as if time had lost its meaning. Alecta had hoped at first that Leandros would return to the boy she had once known, that somehow the light in his eyes would rekindle, and the fire that had burned so brightly in him would return. But that hope, like so many others, had been slowly extinguished, leaving her with a quiet, suffocating emptiness. Leandros had not spoken much since his return. He would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, but it wasn't the way he had once gazed into the hearth, lost in thought, or comforted by its warmth. No, now there was something hollow in his expression, a vacancy that Alecta could not fill. He wasn't just silent. He was distant, as if he had retreated into himself, building walls she could not climb. The boy she had raised, the boy who had once been full of life and dreams, was gone, replaced by a man she couldn't understand, a man broken by something invisible. She tried to reach him, tried to pull him from the depths of the darkness that had swallowed him whole. She would speak to him softly, her words filled with love, but they seemed to fall on deaf ears. He would listen, perhaps, but never respond in any way that made her feel like she was still connected to him. His gaze would flicker to her, but it was as though he were looking through her, not at her. It was the kind of look that made her feel as if she were invisible, as if she were the one who had disappeared from his world. The silence between them was deafening, but it was more than just the absence of words. It was the presence of something far worse, the fear that he would slip away entirely, that the boy she had sent to war would never return. The longer he sat in silence, the more Alecta could feel the distance between them growing. She longed to reach across that chasm, to find some way to touch the part of him that was still hers, but every time she tried, he pulled further away. One evening she sat at the loom, her hands moving through the familiar motions that had once been her comfort, but even that no longer brought her peace. Her mind wandered as she worked, the steady rhythm of the shuttle passing through the threads, offering no distraction from the storm inside her heart. The weight of the silence was too much. She had waited so long for Leandros to return, had hoped so desperately that when he came home he would be the same. But instead he had returned broken, and there was nothing she could do to fix him. She had begun to accept that, to come to terms with the fact that the war had changed him in ways that could never be undone. But that didn't stop the ache inside her. It didn't stop the desperate hope that one day he would speak to her again, that he would look at her the way he used to, with warmth, with love. The crackling of the fire in the hearth was the only sound in the room, and for a moment Alecta thought she might be imagining things. But then she heard it, a soft sound, almost imperceptible at first, like the whisper of footsteps on the stone floor. She turned, her heart racing, her breath catching in her throat. Leandros was standing in the doorway. His figure was dark against the light of the flames, his face unreadable, distant. His posture was slumped, as though the weight of everything that had happened, the battles he had fought, the men he had killed, the pieces of himself he had lost, had become too much to bear. For a moment neither of them spoke. Alecta's hands froze on the loom, and her heart thudded in her chest as she looked at him, waiting, hoping for something, anything, that would tell her he was still her son. But when he spoke, his voice was flat, hollow, as though he were speaking from a place far away. "Mother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm leaving. Alecta's world seemed to tilt on its axis, and for a moment she thought she might collapse as though the weight of his words had struck her physically. She had known deep down that this day would come. She had always known that Leandros, like his father before him, would eventually leave, that he would feel the pull of the battlefield, the call of duty that had shaped every Spartan man. But hearing it from him, hearing him say the words aloud, made it real. It was no longer just a distant fear. It was happening. Her throat tightened, and the words came out before she could stop them. "You don't have to go," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "You can stay here with me." The plea hung in the air, but Leandros didn't move. He didn't step closer to her, didn't soften at the sound of her voice. His face remained impassive, unreadable, as though the emotions she hoped to evoke from him could not reach him any more. He shook his head slowly, the movement small but final. "I don't belong here anymore," he said, his voice distant. "I have to find my own path." The words struck Alecta like a blow. It wasn't just that he was leaving, it was that he had already left in a way long before his body had returned home. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he stood there like a stranger, someone she no longer recognized. The boy who had once leaned on her, who had once trusted her to protect him, was gone. And in his place stood a man distant and hardened, who no longer felt that connection to her, to the home they had shared. Alecta's hands trembled as she slowly set the shuttle down, the sound of it clattering against the loom deafening in the silence of the room. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached out to him, a desperate attempt to pull him back, to hold on to the son she still loved, the son who had once been her world. But he didn't move. He didn't come to her, didn't allow her to touch him. The space between them felt like an ocean, vast and unbridgeable, and Alecta realized with a terrible clarity that she could not save him. He had already made his choice. The war, the call of duty had taken him, had pulled him away in a way she could not undo. Her heart shattered in her chest as she stood there frozen, staring at the son. She had raised the son who had once been so full of life, now so empty. The silence stretched between them, suffocating until Alecta could bear it no longer. She wanted to scream, to beg him to stay, but the words wouldn't come. She had no more strength left to fight, no more hope that things could be different. Leandros didn't look back as he turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. Each step was like a nail in the coffin of her heart. She stood in the doorway, watching him walk away, knowing that the world she had once known was slipping further and further from her reach. Her son, the boy who had once dreamed of a peaceful future, was lost to her, and all she could do was watch him disappear into the world, knowing that there was nothing left to hold on to. As the door closed behind him, Alecta collapsed to her knees. Her tears falling freely now, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She had given everything for this family, her love, her devotion, her heart, and now she felt as though she had lost them both. Demetrius had already been claimed by the war, and now Leandros, too, was slipping away from her, taken by the very thing that had torn them all apart. She had spent her life hoping for a future of peace, of safety, of a home where her family could thrive. But that future had been shattered, and in its place was a quiet, painful truth. The price of war had claimed them all, and there was nothing left to do but to say goodbye. Alecta sat once again at her loom, the threads crossing and intertwining. She had woven the tapestry of her life, filled with both joy and sorrow. But it was clear now that the threads of war had woven a path she could never have imagined. Leandros was gone, and Demetrius was still here, but not the man he once was. The world was filled with scars, both seen and unseen. But Alecta knew as the shuttle moved through the threads that no matter the cost, she would keep weaving. Years later, when the war had finally ended and the dust had settled, Alecta sat once again at her loom. The room was silent, save for the sound of the shuttle gliding through the fabric. She thought of Demetrius, who had returned to her, but was no longer the man he had been. She thought of Leandros, who had fought bravely, but had lost something in the process. History remembers their battles, she whispered again, her voice carrying through the empty room. But I remember the silence between them, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to think of what could have been of the life that might have been possible if the silence between them had been enough to stop the wars. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more stories that delve into the past and explore the timeless struggles of the human heart.